So picking up where we left off in class, we were talking about different major psychedelics. We were talking about different kinds of substances that are known to produce profound altered states of consciousness. And so now we're moving to other types of things that can possibly produce altered states of consciousness. And so one that I wanted to talk about today was the idea of meditation. And so if we think about being able to achieve altered states through a mechanism like meditation and actually induce an altered state, this is kind of a really interesting way to do it. And I do want to be clear that not everyone feels that, and by everyone, not everyone, I mean that different scientists and different philosophers, not everyone feels like there are different states when it comes to altered states. And so there might be an argument against meditation being used to create an altered state because it's not actually different. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But this is kind of a lot of the evidence I'm providing is in support of meditation being a way that you can achieve or induce an altered state. So one thing I just want to really make sure to emphasize here is that there are lots of different meditation types, right? So we've talked about a lot in class. We have talked about some that are more focused, where the point of the meditation, the purpose of the meditation is to get you focused and to get you into a frame of mind where you can concentrate better and think more clearly. And then there's also other types of meditation styles where you are essentially allowing yourself to mind wander. It's a more unfocused, open meditation technique, and we've talked about that in class. So I want to be clear that there are different meditation types. There's different purposes behind meditation, but not all meditation types purposes would be to achieve an altered state. So there are many that do have in part of their purpose and focus is to achieve some kind of altered state. Transcendental meditation is a great example of this, trying to kind of move your frame of mind in a different place to promote happiness, to promote a different kind of enlightened experience, right? But not all meditation sort of frameworks work that way. One particular is this idea of Zen and Zen Buddhists. So the point of the practice, the aim, is not to achieve an altered state or necessarily to reach any goal. It's meditation is the task at hand. It is the aim of the practice, is to achieve meditation. And so we can definitely acknowledge that Zen Buddhists can still have very dramatic, although temporary, awakening experiences and may sort of translate this to be sort of an altered state, but that's not the drive for it. That's not the purpose. Also, one thing to talk about here is that enlightenment itself is not considered a state of consciousness. To attempt to achieve enlightenment is almost like beyond achieving a state of consciousness, an altered state. So this is not considered, enlightenment in of itself is not considered an altered state, and is not, that's just not something that Zen Buddhists are aiming for in terms of consciousness. So when we think about the different kinds of functioning, right, and the possibilities that one can achieve an altered state through meditation, through the types where the purpose is to achieve an altered state, we can argue that an altered state of consciousness is induced because mental functioning is altered. And if you remember from previously when we were talking about the different mental functionings that are impacted, and this was from Farthing's list, and this came from a paper that was published in 1992. There were different lists of mental functions that we covered. For example, we talked about attention. We talked about perception, time perception. We talked about sensation, self-control, arousal, memory, sense of personal identity. These are all things that can be altered in terms of mental functioning that can kind of indicate a change or alteration in state of consciousness. We do know that we can talk about mental functioning changes when you are in a meditative state. So, for example, we have those studies that were conducted looking at like a blue vase. And so you're meant to focus on the blue vase, and people describe that the blue is bluer. And so this, change in sensation, a change in color perception, this is a change in mental functioning. This is something that we can actually test and see and subjectively measure in individuals. And so these are types of things that we need to think about in terms of, hey, we have evidence that suggests this change in mental functioning. Therefore, this is indicating that it's an altered state. We also know that there are things that people experience in terms of like being able to focus or attentive sort of capacities. So like if you're in an open state of meditation, your attention is spread differently than if you're in a focused state. And again, that's a difference in mental functioning, specifically in attention, that we see happening. Now, those against it that say, no, meditation does not produce an altered state, their stance is basically altered states don't exist when you're meditating because it's essentially like you're sleeping or dozing. So think of when you're in a really sleepy state and you're about to fall asleep, that should be what the brain mind is doing that you see in a meditative state. The problem is that we don't have evidence that supports this idea. We have evidence to support the opposite. There's EEG evidence that suggests that there are differences in brainwave activity from when a person's asleep versus in a meditative state. And we will talk more about this later, but there are different sort of types of brainwaves that we see in different states that we can see in sleep itself. So this can be broken down into REM and non-REM sleep, which we'll cover later. Okay, and we actually do see different brain wave patterns for this. We see different brainwave patterns with meditation, and we see different brainwave patterns during sleepiness, right? Microsleeps can occur during meditation, which can be considered almost in of themselves smaller altered states or different altered states. But again, this is something that's different than being in a meditative state. So the evidence is saying, kind of pushing us toward the meditative states can be achieved, altered states can be achieved during meditation. We also have evidence in EEG and fMRI that says that not only are we measuring sort of objectively, where people say, I see a difference in mental function, and, subjectively, I feel like I am in an altered state, we can also look at this objectively, and we can have these EEG and fMRI work that says, EEG, not EGG, that says there is something going on in the brain while you're in a particular altered state. And we've got this evidence from the jhanas. So jhanas comes from this kind of early Buddhist origins where we see 8 levels of absorbed states. And so if you think about these different levels, these different jhanas, right? One of the jhanas, the first one is referred to as extreme joy. So if you take a Buddhist monk who has trained in achieving the different levels of the jhanas, and you put them in an MRI, and then you run a fMRI, what you'll find is that when they shift from their normal regular state to the first jhana, which is extreme joy, you can see increased activation of the nucleus accumbens. So we can ask the person, how do you feel? And they can say subjectively, I feel extreme joy. Okay, so that would indicate they're in the first jhanas. Then you look at their nucleus accumbens, objectively measure that, and see, ooh, we have increased activation in nucleus accumbens. Now you have both subjective and objective evidence that supports a shift in altered states. And so this actually supports, I know I've said before, I've had some issues with Tart's map, and that was done in 1975, and he mapped the different altered states of consciousness, and he called the different states discrete, and they had to fall in a specific quadrant. This is actually evidence for Tart's discrete states idea, And that not only do they fit nicely subjectively, but we also have objective evidence that says that these different shifts can be demonstrated using neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience techniques. So I do think that I'm kind of on the side of saying that I really do think that we can see some very, very good evidence for meditation being a platform for being able to achieve altered states. Another thing that's really important to consider is this idea of mental illness. Now, this is going to feel a little kind of messy, and that's because it is, okay? So if we think about different spontaneously occurring altered states, right? So just from day to day, there's going to be fluctuations in your ordinary wakefulness, right? So you might find sort of a spontaneous shift in like you're focused and now you're kind of drifting off and daydreaming. Maybe you're feeling a little drowsy, you're seeing a circadian dip, right? You might be in a state where you're kind of more likely to fall asleep. You can see spontaneously occurring altered states in dreaming and in sleep as well. So it does occur throughout the day in a spontaneous way. We can also see cases where altered states can be induced environmentally. So, for example, if a person is in a very hot environment or a very cold environment, we see that altering different mental functions, which can be translated as an altered state. So, for example, if you're very, very hot, sometimes you have trouble focusing. If you change your altitude, so if you're in a high altitude place, you might find that you have trouble with paying attention. You have trouble with sort of staying conscious, right? Starvation, orgasm, all of these things you see shifting based off of the environment, right? We can also see that altered states can be physiologically induced. And then you can also see states being illness induced. And so, for example, if a person is sleep deprived or if they're oxygen deprived, you can see an altered state where they have trouble maintaining focus. They might have trouble maintaining consciousness. They might not know where they are. They're very disoriented. They may have trouble with their memory. We also see illness-induced altered states through things like fever. And so if an individual has a fever that can, a very high fever can cause seizures, but even in the fever state, we can see people acting feverish. It's even a kind of a way to talk about things. They seemed feverish. They seemed kind of, like they weren't paying attention. They were very kind of out of it, right? That's an altered state. So all of these things can be, it can induce an altered state. Another thing that we can look at is psychologically induced states. So if a person is in like a rhythmic trance, you're going to see a different state. If they experience sensory deprivation, even bereavement can put people in a completely altered state than what they're used to as their typical. Even hypnosis can put people in different states. We'll talk about that in a minute. The problem is that if we talk about mental illness, so these are all kind of, we can think of as temporary, right? So these are temporary situations. If we think of mental illness, especially long-term mental illness, where a person is dealing with something over their whole life or extended period of time, we think about the blurriness, right? So it becomes really blurry. It's really difficult to draw a line between the psychological and physiological because people are experiencing this every day, all day, from day to day. If we think about people when they're healthy versus when they're ill, when a person is in a state where perhaps they are not being medicated, they may consider that whatever pathological state they're in is actually a reality. And what happens is if they do that, it can actually stop somebody from seeking treatment because they don't think anything's wrong. They say, this is my normal, right? This is my normal. This is how I feel. I don't need to seek help. There's nothing wrong with me, especially when a person is in a particular state that is very in a very psychotic state or a very manic state, right? If they're in an extreme state, especially when it's an emotion state, it can be really difficult for them to distinguish reality, very difficult for them to distinguish that there's a problem. Another thing that we need to think about is like, what is this person's normal, right? What is their baseline? And is baseline when they're healthy? Is baseline when they're medicated? Is baseline when they're not medicated? Is illness an altered state in of itself? If we think about schizophrenia and the psychosis that's experienced, if that's a permanent pathological state, is it these temporary episodes where we see extreme versions of psychoticism? Are those altered states, or is the, sort of permanent pathological state, is that the person's baseline? These are all really important questions that don't have exact answers, but I think things that we need to think about. So when considering mental illness, and is that baseline state the medicated state? Is that state the I'm functional state? Okay, what is that? If we consider some conditions are completely continuous cognitive states, so if we think a person being in a state of depression for 10 years, or if they are experiencing body dysmorphia for their entire life, if they have ongoing distortions, at what point do we see there's an alteration, a state of consciousness, or is it that period of time is that whole experience is altered state, and is the healthy baseline healthy compared to other people, or is it healthy compared to that person? So I think it gets very, very, very difficult to differentiate, especially because, we don't, if you're introducing medication into the mix, now you're saying, well, is the person's normal when they're medicated? Is it, considered compared to other individuals? Is it compared to the same individual? These are kinds of things that are questions that are really, really difficult to answer. We also can't really reduce it connectivity patterns, because also we have to think about the subjectivity, right, of this whole thing. If you take away how the person feels and how they rate themselves and think about their own different states of consciousness, we're taking away that subjective component, and that is, in essence, the spirit of what consciousness is, right, is that whole subjective feeling. And then we can even introduce even more complicated things like dissociative identity disorder, which is basically multiple personality disorders, where we say that there's multiple alters, multiple personalities, multiple senses of self, and each of these can have their own altered state. So there's so many ways that we could explore this. It just brings up way more questions than answers. But I do think this is something that we need to really heavily consider when we're thinking about altered states. The final thing I want to talk about is another sort of platform for achieving an altered state, and that's hypnosis. I've got a nice little question mark here, because this actually prompted a really, really, really huge debate and argument in the early 19th century. So hypnosis comes from the Greek word hypnos, meaning sleep. And so it's kind of like seen as a very interesting sort of, many people consider it its own state. But there were two positions in the early 19th century where this kind of argument came up. Okay, we have position one, which is hypnosis is a different state. It is an altered state, but it's more of considered a state like sleepwalking. So sleepwalking is also referred to as somnambulism, which is usually experienced in non-REM sleep and deep sleep, and a person is able to kind of walk around. They seem like they're awake, but they're not. They don't usually remember it, but they tend to be open, to suggestibility. They tend to be open to, they don't seem to be all there, okay? So that's position one, is that hypnosis is a state. It's considered very similar to a state of sleepwalking. And these would be the state theorists. So these say, it's a unique state, an altered state from normal. Position two, these basically debated that hypnosis is not a state. Anything that we see that would be defined as altered is actually just, the fact that the person is open to suggestion. So they just have a good imagination, and they are able to just change their behavior to try to please the hypnotist. Okay? So all the effects of hypnosis essentially are attributed to suggestion and imagination. These are the non-state theorists. So these also believe that there are no states to be in, right? So if you guys remember, think of it like if you're going to be in a state, you can think of consciousness as being a container, which sounds very much like Cartesian theater, right? So if you can be in something, if you can be in a state, therefore that's a very Cartesian theater way of thinking about consciousness. So we know that there are physiological observations that we can make when a person's undergoing hypnosis. So we do actually see neural effects. The anterior cingulate is very important to this. It's related to reduced pain when a person is in a hypnotic state. We know that hypnosis is used for people like burn victims, right? There have actually been some, very few, but some successful surgeries that were conducted not using anesthesia, but using hypnosis. We know that it helps take people, for example, who are burn victims or who are in extreme pain. It can help them control their responses and be less susceptible to experiencing extreme pain because they are able to cope with it better in a hypnotic state. Okay. We know that the anterior cingulate is involved in this. So we know that we see different activation in a hypnotic state versus not. Okay. So there are, these sort of debates driven about what is hypnosis. One argument is that the hypnotist is able to access the hidden part of the mind. We call this sort of idea, being the hidden observer, being able to access this part. And because there are different parts of the mind, these can be accessed in different ways, and different doors can be opened. So for example, hypnotism would be able to open those doors. Okay. Some argue that the person's just very open to suggestion. And we do know that people who do well under hypnosis tend to be more open to suggestibility. We can look at that through the Tellegen absorption scale. And if people who score very high absorbed types can do very well in hypnosis. And also, one important thing to think about with hypnosis is if you do not believe that it's going to work on you, somebody cannot hypnotize you. You have to have some element of being open to suggestibility for hypnosis to work. So this idea of like there's a hidden observer, you're able to kind of access the hidden part of the mind. This is kind of one suggestion of how hypnosis works. This whole debate has been kind of driven by this idea of, is hypnosis considered an altered state? If it is, it kind of implies sort of this kind of Cartesian theater aspect of consciousness if you're going to be in something. So some don't like the word state and want to instead use the word label, which is still kind of categorizing a different state. So, these are definitely things that we have to consider. Non-state theorists basically say there's no state to be in. There is no, there's nothing to be in or out of. Okay. Others argue that this is a continuum, rather being in or out of something. It's not a dichotomy. It's just a continuum. Think of it like a spectrum, that there's no distinct discrete states, which would then go against what Tart was saying. So there's a lot of argument here. And so we have evidence for lots of different things, but I think we do have a lot of really good evidence for saying that there are discrete states, and even hypnosis has evidence towards different things being affected by potentially hypnotic state. So I think we should keep our minds open. We should think about, we should definitely have these kinds of discussions, but also think that we need to look at some of the evidence as well. And there's a lot of really good evidence for both sides, but there's a lot of really good evidence that hypnosis is very helpful for things like people who've undergone, high pain sort of trauma. It's also helped people who are experiencing addiction and trying to recover from that, as well as it's used for insomnia and anxiety as well. So, I mean, it's definitely helped a lot of people out, and I think that we shouldn't discount it as a potential avenue for achieving different altered states to help us in our other states and behaviors that we experience. So, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. Hope everyone has a great day.